games. Ocarina of Time 3D is the definitive version
First
of
time
the game.
Neeko.
There is no reason to play the N64 original beyond its retro
Let's start
appeal and
boots because that should
nostalgic
make it
value.
easier.
The aiming is much more precise thanks to the innovation of the gyroscope. Textures and character models have been completely remade for the modern day, and with it a smoother frame rate from 20 frames to 30 frames. Not quite 60, but I'll take it over the sluggish pace of the original. Inventory management is handled in the bottom screen of the 3DS, which makes for quick menu access. The iron boots and hover boots are now face button items instead of equipment to be changed in the menu. You can take the iron boots on and off at the press of a button, significantly improving the pace of the dreaded water temple. Link can also have 4 items on face buttons for instant use instead of 3 with the N64's C stick. Well, not really a stick, I guess. They're C buttons. Whatever. The bottom screen displays the map of the area you're in, how many keys you have, how many rupees you have, and the ocarina is forever bound to the bottom left, so you never have to swap it out with another face button item. The text scroll has been shortened so the story presents itself at a much more respectable pace. The Sheikah stones were introduced to give players a hint as to what to do next, which is a godsend given how obtuse progression is in between dungeons. The 3DS version comes with some new bells and whistles, like a boss rush and the packed-in Master Quest mode with redesigned dungeons and a mirrored map, similar to how Twilight Princess was handled across versions. I happen to believe it's simply inarguable that the N64 is anywhere close to the 3DS version. It's fine to still prefer playing the N64 version, of course, everyone has preferences, but there are almost no downsides to playing the game on the 3DS besides the smaller screen size. As a result, this retrospective is going to be heavily focused on each game's remake, excluding the last 2 games which don't have any. You might as well call this a 3D Zelda remake discussion because they will be the foundation of my critique. There are plenty of other analyses of each original game out there for you to enjoy. I recommend the videos from Mathematosis and Retropolis Zone for Ocarina of Time specifically. So yeah, the 3DS version is clearly superior. Let's get into the actual game on offer here because not much has really changed. Same story, same dungeons, same items. What do I make of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time 3D? Here's some context. I have significantly more experience playing 3D Zelda. If I'm honest, I've never gotten even a quarter of the way through A Link to the Past. Sorry, I know that's a death sentence in the Zelda community, but I haven't. On the contrary, A Link Between Worlds is the only 2D Zelda game I've ever finished and loved. The rest of my love for the franchise is rooted solely in the 3D installments. As a result, I don't have much in the way of comparison to A Link to the Past. I do, however, see the difference between the design philosophy of Ocarina when compared to the first Zelda game. The first Zelda game was a pure adventure. It popped you into a world, said go, and it was all up to you. It forces nothing on you. Well, you can even skip the sword if you don't decide to enter the cave. I can't say I particularly like playing the original Zelda. I find it extremely archaic and the combat is strictly limited to short stabs in the 4 directions Link can walk. This control scheme feels really outdated and it artificially enhances the game's difficulty in a way I don't appreciate very much. However, there is one thing I absolutely respect about the original Zelda. The sheer freedom it allows the player. You can go anywhere and do anything. It might end up biting you in the ass if you aren't prepared, but that feeling of getting lost in a game, just exploring everything it has to offer without the constant nagging waypoint telling you where to go next, is a promising idea. Were it attached to a competent game, I'd be all for it. It's primarily why I enjoy the Soulsborne series so much. Ocarina of Time is the polar opposite. The freedom it allows is limited to the side objectives and a few dungeons you can do out of order. For instance, if you really want to, you can do the Water Temple before doing the Fire Temple, and you can also do the Spirit Temple before doing the Shadow Temple. That isn't the order Navi will push you toward, but it's an order you can do if you want. This makes for an incredibly linear story progression, perhaps rightfully criticized in sequelitis as being demonstrably worse than the design philosophy of the original. You have to admit, it's a lot easier to pick up and play Ocarina of Time. I first played it in 2012 and had a pretty easy time getting to grips with it, in stark contrast to almost all of my attempted playthroughs of the original Zelda. But I'd be hard-pressed to argue that I prefer the more linear design philosophy when compared to the non-linear focus of the original. I do not, however, think that because the game is more linear, it equals a bad Zelda game. That simply isn't true. Even one playthrough should be enough to show how competent a Zelda game it still is. One of the downsides to having a game be so non-linear is the question of how to handle the story progression. There's an ever-pervasive monster haunting the narratives of open-world gaming. That monster's name is a big, scary concept known as ludonarrative dissonance. I can demonstrate what I mean using Fallout 4. I know everyone likes to pick on this game, but can you really say it's without justification? The setup of that game's story involves your significant other being murdered in front of your eyes and your child being stolen. Your character's drive is to save your child from whomever decided to fuck with you. There is a jarring disconnect in such a non-linear game when you can completely ignore the main quest to save your child in favor of doing relatively less important quests in the wasteland. There is a very real possibility that the priorities of the player will directly contradict the priorities of the playable character. This dissonance grows ever stronger the more you're allowed to do, and in an open-world Bethesda Softworks game, that means several hundred hours of content completely divorced from the main story. Linearity often goes hand in hand with well-crafted storytelling. Ocarina of Time definitely lets you explore Hyrule, but the restrictions on the scale of the world ensure that the diversions found while exploring don't take too much away from the overarching story driving Link forward. You can even argue the exploration is key to Link becoming strong enough to defeat Ganondorf, which at the end of the day is the ultimate goal. Strength in a fight against someone who holds a piece of the Triforce and usurped the throne is pretty important. In a plot to find your son, urgency supersedes strength and experience. This isn't to say that non-linear games can't tell a well-paced story. They just struggle to tell such a tightly paced narrative when there is so much player freedom. Fallout New Vegas presents a brilliant method to deliver a narrative by seamlessly interweaving player choice into the narrative. The only information you have upon booting up a new save is that you were shot by someone. You don't know what your life was before you were shot, so you're essentially plopped into the world with nary a clue what to do next. You can track down your shooter, sure, but it's entirely realistic your character wouldn't want to do that. Some people might want to avoid the person who nearly murdered them. Within the context of Fallout New Vegas' beginning, you are given the freedom to explore the world and uncover its secrets without the shackle of an overarching character need. From this point, you can go about the story of the game however you like, with several different factions you can align with, which lead to several different endings based on what you believe your character would do at any given moment. This is the key to non-linear storytelling, and as great as it is to have such a wide array of choices, you still can't get the same linear story experience, at least one with good pacing. All of this is to say that Ocarina of Time delivers a simple yet compelling narrative because of how linear it is. The evolution of Child Link faffing about in Kokiri Forest, waiting for his life to start, into fully equipped adult Link who readily takes on Ganondorf after storming his castle, is such a satisfying leap. It so seamlessly ties into themes of growth. As a kid, you can't do much, and no one really asks you to do a whole lot. Most NPCs just tell you to fuck off. It isn't until you're grown up that the world is depending on you to save the day. As an adult, you can explore the world more thoroughly and take on some of the toughest threats it has to offer, including Ganondorf. The world feels more oppressive when you're grown up. Hyrule Castle is ruined, filled with Gyvdos. Lon Lon Ranch has been taken over by this asshat. Goron City is empty after the Gorons were all captured and locked away in the Fire Temple. Zora's domain is frozen over. You're the only one who can save Hyrule. It's a very empowering story for a child to experience, but it's also easy to relate to after you really do grow up. Growing up is a bit scary. You have more responsibility, more power, more authority. It's easy to crumble under the pressure of it all, but Ocarina of Time shows you can surmount even the most intimidating obstacles. Ganondorf proves that. He is a scary son of a bitch. He only appears briefly, and because of that, it's always a big deal whenever he shows up. The brief encounters you do have with him show off his hostile appearance, and after he steals the Triforce from the Sacred Realm and takes over Hyrule, you run through the rest of the game knowing he's waiting for you in his castle. Eventually, you'll have to take him on. The final fight is such a rewarding payoff because of that. You've managed to save the Gorons, Princess Ruto, Nabooru. You can save Hyrule from the clutches of Ganondorf after all you've done. The climax is incredibly powerful, and that final blow to the skull is one of the best feelings ever. It would be very easy to understate the narrative of Ocarina of Time, but it's so core to the overall experience, I have a hard time believing the game would have been as strong without it. That said, I'm not usually playing Zelda for the story, so let's examine how such a linear progression affects how you play the game.
Bye-bye. This champ's fun.
I'm going with Frankie C.
Jake, how you doing? She broke my heart.
Sometimes things break, but when they do, State Farm be there for that too. Let's get you back out to Cleveland. Like a good neighbor?
Like he's not farming strat.
3D Zelda gets a pretty bad rap
I
for
watched
having
Days
very
my game
lengthy
before I started
opening
playing.
sequences that harm multiple playthroughs.
So
I think
it's
one of the
good to
most
see it.
surprising aspects to
So
Ocarina
nice.
is how quickly it gets going. You explore Kokiri
Wait, what?
Forest and get
Did I
to
just
grips
lose
with the
health?
controls of 3D Zelda, which are admittedly hard to adjust to. The A button doesn't jump, it rolls. To jump, you have to walk off ledges, which, as many have pointed out, flies in the face of conventional game design. That's why it's nice to have an environment that
He
forces you
lives
to
somehow.
explore it for rupees to progress.
I don't
It
know
isn't
if
hard at all to get a sword and a shield
get
on
rid
your
of the
second
other blue.
playthrough. It takes almost no effort. And after you do that, you enter the first dungeon, which gives you the slingshot so you can start playing around with new items and puzzles. Accessible is the perfect word to describe the opening of Ocarina. It takes almost no time at all to get going, while still allowing the breathing room for newcomers to get used to how Link controls. The first dungeon isn't necessarily anything to write home about, but it's a perfectly fine introduction to 3D Zelda's dungeon design on a basic level. You find the slingshot very early on, and it makes the dungeon a lot easier because you can now deal with the pesky Skulltula on the vines blocking your path, as well as the keys, that are tricky to deal with when you only have your dinky little sword. It's also the only way to get Goma down to the
Somewhat
ceiling.
free.
The dungeon makes
This champ.
great use of bleeding space. As you climb up the tree, it adds a sense of vertigo that you can't have in a 2D game. This height even allows you to interact with the dungeon, making use of your velocity when falling to break through the spiderweb in the central room. It also teaches you to light your Deku Stick to move fires to different locations, to light torches, or burn spiderwebs. You're taught this so that you're familiar with many of the concepts Ocarina of Time will use for puzzle solving. Lighting every torch in a room, for example, will be used time and time again for optional and mandatory progression.
No skill
Most of
bait.
the dungeons have logic puzzles. Much like setting fire to a spiderweb, you need to know that sunlight will activate sun panels,
Should trigger
and
the,
bombs will
dark
break
rooms.
weak walls. It isn't until Dodongo's Cavern where you're overwhelmed with the amount of pathways you see just by starting the dungeon. As soon as you walk in, there are several doors on either side and bridges at the top linking together different rooms. This uncertainty as to where you need to progress is
I'm not
key to
using
some
this
of the
passive, it
strongest
seems gimmicky.
dungeons. Finding the way forward is initially difficult, and once you do, the dungeon will test your awareness of your surroundings. Once you unlock the bombs, for instance, you need to figure out that the bombs will work on the eyes of the giant skull to open the way to the boss. The genius of this key item is that it's an upgrade of something you've been using for half the dungeon, the bomb flowers. The bomb flowers act like every other bomb, but they're stationary. This means if your target is too far away from the bomb flower, it won't be possible to use it to blow up the target. Once you get the bomb
She's
bag,
done.
you can now blow up anything you want. This opens up the entire dungeon and lets
I
you
literally
explore a
just
few
right-clicked
new
it.
areas you may have needed mental note of. It's very reminiscent of the Metroidvania genre. This complexity is taken to the logical extreme in the Water Temple. This is probably controversial, but the Water Temple is the best dungeon in Ocarina of Time, and I can say that more
Ignite's
confidently
really
playing
nice
the
on this
3DS
channel.
version, where the iron boots aren't a pain in the ass to use. This dungeon is the culmination of everything I've just laid out. When you enter it, you can see the entrance to every single pathway. It's intimidating to figure out where to even begin. Once you find the panels on the wall to control the water level, the dungeon opens up piece by piece. You begin to explore your options until you find the next two panels. When you have a grasp of all three water levels, that's when the dungeon becomes truly labyrinthian. And progress is gated in two main ways: the long shot and the amount of small keys. Since the water levels open up so many pathways, you'll often enter a path and be forced to turn back because you lack a small key to open the door, or your
pretty good
hookshot
play
isn't
by,
long enough to reach a hookshot panel. What this forces the
Hello.
player to do is ruthlessly explore each and every pathway and experiment with the water levels until you obtain that small key you desperately needed, or that long shot to finally cross that gap you couldn't cross before. Since the pathways aren't very long and the central room is pretty small, all, it ensures that backtracking isn't overly cumbersome. This is very good because odds are you'll end up doing a lot of backtracking to fuck with the water levels to find the correct pathway forward. The rest of the dungeons in the game try to live up to the water temple to varying degrees of success. It's still somewhat easy to get lost in the fire temple, for instance, because there are so many pathways. Once you get the megaton hammer, the dungeon is significantly more straightforward, but the path to that item is fairly arduous. The forest temple makes good use of multiple pathways to confuse the player. There's really only one path forward, but you have so many options when you start the dungeon that the way forward is never obvious. Even when you do find the way forward, you may lack a key that's located in another segment of the dungeon you have yet to explore. Additionally, once you get the bow, there are several areas where you can use it to progress or unlock secrets. These two dungeons don't quite reach the same complex heights as the Water Temple, but they're complex enough that they're fun to figure out. The Shadow Temple is the least successful at emulating the Water Temple. It's by far the most linear adult dungeon in the game. I don't tend to count the first 3 dungeons as Child Link because they don't even have small keys in them. If anything, they're more preliminary dungeons meant to get you accustomed to 3D spatial awareness. That said, I think Jabu Jabu's belly is even a bit harder to figure out than the Shadow Temple. The major issue with the Shadow Temple is how much of a straight shot it is. There's a straight line through to the dungeon boss, and there are several detours on that path. Most of them are incredibly simple. Say there's a locked door. There's probably a detour right around the corner to unlock a small key to open that locked door. You can never have more than one small key. Every time you get one, you use it 10 seconds later to open up more of the main path. I wouldn't say it's a terrible dungeon, but it is comparatively much weaker.
But it's the fact that it does so many.
The Spirit Temple errs on the dangerous side of this linearity, but I think it's saved by the unique implementation of the time travel. Having to play the first half of the dungeon as Child Link is a major handicap. Child Link can't use the hookshot or the bow. He has to revert back to using his aether sword, slingshot, and boomerang. He even goes up against enemies that Adult Link is required to fight, including the Iron Knuckle at the end of his segment. Without this, the Spirit Temple would probably be even worse than the Shadow Temple. It's very easy to figure out where to go next, and from there you progress from room to room until you get the boss key and go straight to the boss without much to think about. There may be even less branching paths than in the Shadow Temple. The reason I find this very important is because the actual puzzle solving is pretty hit or miss. There are some successful puzzles. I'm thinking specifically of puzzles like this one in the Spirit Temple, where you have to copy the actions of a floating mummy thing that mirrors your every move. Later in the dungeon it becomes more complicated, having to deal with 3 of them in the same room, and with only 1 ring of fire to dispatch them. The reason it's such a good puzzle is because you're always actively solving it. It's not as if you figured out the solution as soon as you put 2 and 2 together. You're always figuring out how the things mirroring you move, and how to get them into the fire. Similarly, the Silver Rupee puzzles are great because you're always active when collecting them. Hookshot onto a panel, equip the hover boots to reach a far-off rupee, defeat a Beamos to uncover a rupee. You need to figure out how to get each rupee on the fly, and the introduction of stage hazards puts even more pressure on you to finish the puzzle as quickly as possible. The problematic puzzles are the ones you solve long before you complete them. Block-pushing puzzles are easily the most egregious. In the Spirit Temple, you'll likely immediately figure out that you're supposed to push this sunblock into the sunlight to open a door. It's the process of this that makes it horrible. First, you have to move 2 of the blocks out of the way,
Can she
and
die
then
to
start
just
pulling
that?
the sunblock out of where it's trapped to get it over to the sunlight. This is a case where the puzzle was solved long before you complete it, because block pushing is so slow. I wouldn't be surprised if the dev team got a little bit too excited to implement context-sensitive actions that almost no thought went into how that would translate into a fun puzzle-solving experience. It's an easy trap to fall into when dealing with new technology. The part that really ruins this is that there's no way to speed up the slow speed at which
One of these will make me better in log fights like that.
Even when he gets the silver or gold gauntlets, he still pushes every block at the
10%
same
extra
speed.
damage.
I'm willing to chalk this up to a simple oversight, because block pushing has never been as obnoxious in any other Zelda game except this one. At least they learn from it, right? Additionally, there are puzzles that make use of the 3D space. Be that an eye on the wall you need to shoot with your bow and arrow, or a hookshot panel hidden on a ceiling to make it to a higher
Overestimating my
area.
damage. He
These
does a
aren't
lot,
so much
but
puzzles
I
as they are tests of your spatial awareness. It's used most effectively when you do things like shoot an arrow through a flame to melt an eye panel.
Hey,
This is
this
something the
cooldown,
game
why
never
is it so
teaches you how
low?
to do, but it's the logical conclusion to the puzzle given how little there is in the room. It calls back to the logic puzzles I mentioned earlier. Most of the time, finding my way through a dungeon was much more satisfying than the puzzles I had to solve in them. While some of the puzzles are fairly weak, it doesn't take away from the feeling of accomplishment that comes from fully exploring every nook and cranny for optional items and extras. The way I see it, eye panels and bombable walls are just more unique ways to progress as opposed to the dungeon simply using a door. Yeah, they might not be hard to figure out, but it's better than just walking up to a door and pressing the A button. The block puzzles though, yeah, I can't really defend them. How about the bits in between dungeons? They serve as an opportunity to test out some of your new items in the overworld, as well as dole out new bits of story, most likely from Sheik.
Not put this shit
Unfortunately,
down
there are
anymore,
more
which
than a
is
few
really good.
times where the logical next step is, well, illogical. The best example I can think of is after you leave Kokiri Forest. Saria gives you an ocarina as a parting gift and you run off. To make a long story short, you use the ocarina to open a path to Darunia to hopefully get him to open the path to Dodongo's cavern. You try to play Zelda's Lullaby and it doesn't work. You keep saying he wants something he can dance to. I'm not sure how in the fuck you're supposed to figure this out. The only reason I eventually figured it out is because Navi tells you, hey, maybe you should go talk to Saria. The logical next step should never be to travel back to Kokiri Forest to talk to Saria, especially after your heartfelt goodbye with her moments before. But no, you have to do the Lost Woods puzzle, talk to Saria so she can teach you a song to make Darunia happy again. There's no reason I can think of that Saria couldn't have taught you the song when she gave you the ocarina. This means you have to run back to Kokiri Forest through Hyrule Field, which is one of the most barren overworlds in gaming history. Yes, I'm aware there's a shortcut in Goron City to the Lost Woods, but you can't open that up until you play
He's
Saria's
supposed to
song to
have been
Darunia. When you
If
do
someone
that,
else hit him
you
with
get the
something, it
ability
would've
to
been
pick up bomb flowers, thus opening up the shortcut. But until then, you're stuck hauling ass across Hyrule Field. Once you're done with Saria, you have to backtrack from whence you came, lengthening the process of opening Dodongo's cavern even more. I'm not sure how else to get this across, it's shameless padding.
I think it's 'cause we
There
were all
are
grouped. I
minor
got you guys
instances of this,
passive.
like when you first leave Kokiri Forest. There is no possible way to make it to Hyrule Castle in time before nightfall, which is when the drawbridge raises and you can't enter until morning. While it is nice that it forces you to figure out that you can't enter Hyrule at night, it means that you have to wait until daytime to enter, which for me means running around in a circle or fighting the Stalfos to bide time. Yeah, I know, I'm sure there are speedrunners out there that can make it across Hyrule Field before nightfall. I wouldn't doubt it. But your average player wouldn't know how to do that, would they? If you want a really horrible example that everyone points out, it would be the entrance to Jabu Jabu's belly. You have to do this minigame when you dive for rupees to get a scale that lets you dive underwater. You use this scale to dive under the water in Zora's domain,
My
which
team is
leads
really
you to
funny.
Lake Hylia.
Simple
There's a
things.
bottle with a note from Princess Ruto, who is trapped in Jabu
Morsels.
Jabu's belly. If you show it to King Zora, he'll let you through. Well, he'll slowly let you through. You know, eventually he'll let you through.
Keep getting CC'd.
Yeah, eventually.
The gin is pretty
Sometime
big,
this
actually.
week, please. Yeah,
Oh,
so
he's 13
that.
kills.
Then you're at Jabu Jabu and you're out of hits. All you have to go on is a sign telling you not to disturb him. There is truthfully no
We should
way
have
to
this.
progress unless you bottle up a fish in Zoro's domain
can't bear.
and bring it up to Jabu Jabu so he can eat you. The only reason I have never struggled with this is because before my first playthrough of the game, I heard all the bitching online. It's such a legendary example of how not to do progression gating, and everyone complains about it. For good reason, it isn't a logical chain of events. The bits in between dungeons are really boring and obtuse, and that extends to some of the side objectives, of which there are many. The side quests serve to offer players the exploration they might be sorely craving coming off of the fairly linear story. This mostly comes in the form of upgrades to your bags and quiver to hold more bombs and arrows respectively, heart pieces to extend your health bar, upgrades and magic items from the Great Fairy, golden Skulltula tokens which you can turn in for wallet upgrades and other goodies. There's even a sword upgrade you can collect through a trading sequence. Believe it or not, even
definitely
Epona is
didn't take
optional
anything.
until Gerudo Desert. She's in the opening, so you'd think they'd force her on you, but it is very possible you can miss her if you never visit Lon Lon Ranch.
Actually,
I
where
mean,
was
pity your
Nami? I
soul
saw her
if you
approaching
do,
from
because she
here.
makes traversal of Hyrule Field much
And
more
then she's
tolerable.
gone.
It's a worthy payoff to have your travel time decreased as the game goes on. It might make the first few hours a bit annoying, but since Child Link really only sticks to the eastern portion of Hyrule Field, it's never tedious enough to be noteworthy. Many of the side quests
Besides,
perform the same
forever
function
to
as Epona.
get the
The heart
root off
pieces
the
are
mark. She
rewarding
could've
to look
killed him.
for because it means you can take more hits. The magic upgrades from the Great Fairy are pretty cool, like having your magic and health meters essentially doubled. Additionally, finding upgrades makes Link feel more powerful as you trudge along. The Big Goron sword is a fantastic reward. You have to hold it with two hands, meaning you can't use your shield, but it is the strongest weapon in the game, ironically outclassing the Master Sword in almost every way. There are also mandatory upgrades that come in the form of dungeon items that serve the same purpose, but also offer some elements of Metroidvania to the exploration. For instance, after you get the bombs, you can bomb holes in the ground in Hyrule Field to find golden skulltulas and rupees. I wouldn't say there are a ton of elements outside of this that truly make use of the dungeon items in the overworld. In fact, many of the side quests don't even require them. Kind of a shame there wasn't more overworld use for the hookshot as an example. It could have been cool to hide some hookshot panels in the overworld for a heart piece or a golden skulltula. Their use is almost exclusively in dungeons. I'm surprised by how useful the hookshot and bow are to pretty much every dungeon. Items like the bow, hookshot, and bombs are by far the most useful items in the game. The bow has combat applications, as well as the ability to hit faraway bombs or switches. The hookshot can bring Link to a far-off area, as well as collect golden skulltula tokens and stun enemies. And the bombs can break walls, as well as defeat Beamos and other enemies. The rest of the items are poorly utilized outside of their respective dungeons. The iron boots really only serve the purpose of walking underwater. There are no other uses for it. Similarly, the Megaton hammer will smash blocks down in the fire temple and is sometimes used to push rusty switches or break rocks in the overworld. I'm disappointed in the Megaton hammer because it lacks the
I shouldn't have
combat
walked
use of the
backwards.
bow
I
and
killed
hookshot.
Nami.
It has such a short range that using it in combat over the sword is
So I
not
was super
question.
correct.
At the very least, the dungeon items are all pretty fun to use in the context of their own dungeons. The hover boots give a pretty cool extension to your jump length, and the Shadow Temple combines it with the Lens of Truth in a neat way. There's an invisible wall you can't jump to, the gap is too big. Instead, you have to use the Lens of Truth to find the invisible wall, and then equip the hover boots in front of the fan so it pushes you across the gap. Synergy akin to this would have given more use to the items that are quickly forgotten. I've strayed a fair bit off topic, so let's go back to the side objectives exclusively. While many of them have rewarding extras, the process of obtaining the optional extras is occasionally frustrating. We'll take the golden skulltulas for the sake of example. They use audio cues to clue you into their presence, then it's just up to you to look around for them and collect their token. Most of them are hidden pretty well, but there are a few that are needlessly obtuse. You can establish pretty early on that bombing trees will sometimes lead to holes you can enter. So when you see a tree next to Hyrule Castle, you'll maybe want to bomb it. Unfortunately, it won't work. If you don't have the Shard of Agony, you'll probably never know there's a secret under this tree. So, how do you open the hole in the ground? Even though there's no other instance in the game that would lead you to believe this would work, if you play the Song of Storms, a hole in the ground will open. Now, if you're like me in this situation, you may feel like you've been slapped in the face. I feel similarly about the golden skulltula hidden in the soft soil where you plant magic beans. The game never teaches you this, but you can collect bugs in empty bottles and release them over a patch of soft soil to reveal a golden skulltula. You can do this for every patch of soft soil, and that consistency is why it's slightly more acceptable than that Song of Storms bullshit. But there's still never reason to think you could ever do something like that. You'll always know you can place magic beans, but never bugs. How the hell are you even supposed to know you can trap bugs in bottles in the first place? Bugs are never used for anything else. It's this aspect of Ocarina of Time's non-linearity that most reminds me of the original Zelda, and not in a good way. The original Zelda's idea of progression was based on an extreme level of trial and error. It taps into the many ideas presented by René Descartes and Francis Bacon concerning the scientific method. Their works contributed to the idea that you can never truly know something until you've tested it, in the same way you can't know if there's a tree you can bomb until you've bombed every tree in the game. Their findings work wonders for learning new things, but they don't translate well to the interactive
queue out of the way
medium.
there.
The process of finding out what you can burn or bomb isn't compelling in the slightest. The amount of work you have to put in far exceeds the reward you receive. This is exactly how I feel about the more obtuse collectibles in Ocarina. The Skulltulas certainly aren't the only complicated side quest. There are also the trade sequences. There are two major trade sequences, one to obtain the Big Goron sword and the other to obtain the Mask of Truth. The quest to obtain the Big Goron sword is far more straightforward, because the game tells you exactly where to go for each item. It isn't necessarily fun to play the mailman, but at least you know where you're going. I'll reiterate, this is for the 3DS version. I'm not sure how it works in the original. The worst of the two is the mask side quest. This quest is abysmal without a guide. It starts at the Happy Mask shop. You can find it in Hyrule Castletown. The first mask you have to deliver is to this guard in Kakariko Village. You need to give him the yellow Keaton mask that he wants for his son. This one's easy because the guard will tell you he wants the mask, so you can easily go get it for him. You're required to hear this from him on the main quest, so you can never miss it. The next mask is a skull thing that you're supposed to deliver to Skull Kid in the Lost Woods. Unfortunately, no one tells you who to give the mask to. You have to wear the mask and talk to every NPC in the game to find its new owner. I don't think I need to tell you how insanely asinine of a process that would be for 3 masks. You potentially have a situation wherein you'd have to travel to every NPC in the game 3 times to get the masks to the people they belong to. And for what? The Mask of Truth? I mean, it's a neat mask. It can uncover bombable holes in the overworld and can talk with gossip stones, which give neat insight into some of the characters or miscellaneous events that you wouldn't otherwise get from the main story. Like how Malin holds the world record for fastest horse race at her ranch. However, this is in no way a worthy reward given how tedious the quest is, especially when you factor in that there's a Zelda wiki meant to compile all this useless information anyway. Then we come to my personal least favorite side activity in the game, the fishing. Oh boy. There are 2 things you can obtain here, the heart piece and the golden scale. Truthfully though, there are 3 heart pieces you can get out of this ordeal, since there are 2 heart pieces that can't be unlocked until you get the golden scale. I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert at fishing. In fact, that's precisely the problem. The guy at the beginning tells you the basics, and it took me a little while to get used to how it controls, but eventually I found my footing. Apparently there's a secret sinking lure you can get after netting a big enough fish, but I couldn't find it for the life of me. The small fish are pretty easy to get, but those aren't what net you the big rewards. The much bigger fish, basically over 10 pounds, get you the rewards you actually want. Here's the issue. Mechanically, I'm still not really sure what the proper way is to reel in a fish. I have a general idea. When the fish is facing you, you're holding the control stick in the right direction. When it isn't, you aren't holding it in the right direction. But when you start coming up against the bigger fish, it's practically impossible to figure out where to hold the pole. You first have to find out where the sweet spot is, something I assume changes every 2 seconds because that's the biggest hurdle to cross by far. I try to slowly move my circle pad around to find the sweet spot, usually to no avail. If I ever do find the sweet spot where the fish faces me, I found that circling around very slowly counterclockwise will make sure you keep hitting all of the sweet spots that change every couple seconds. If you can do this correctly, I think this is how you fish. The major issue is with the first sweet spot. It's so hard to find that most of the time, the fish would escape my lure after 3 or so minutes of fucking around. If you fail to catch the fish, it swims to the middle, where unless you have that sinking lure, you can't catch shit. They're too far below the water to even notice your lure. This means you have to return the fishing pole, exit the fishing hole, re-enter the fishing hole, pay another 20 rupees to fish, then the fish will have respawned where it began when you first entered. I was at this stupid fucking minigame for a good 3 hours before I finally got what I needed. I'd rather play Big the Cat in Sonic Adventure 1 than this trite. Now, I do want to highlight some of the better side objectives because they do exist. The Gerudo training grounds are pretty damn fun. I'll admit, I've never used the ice arrows in my life. Not joking,
Oh my gosh,
I
you
never
actually-
use them, so in that respect, the
Yeah, I
reward
can
is
totally do.
underwhelming. But the dungeon itself is cool, making use of small keys to find treasures at the end. Most of the heart pieces and Skulltulas are very satisfying to find. Golden Skulltulas and dungeons are perhaps the most rewarding to seek out. Many of them are hidden reasonably well, especially the ones where you're required to use the Scarecrow song, which in the case of the Fire Temple unlocks a whole new optional segment to the dungeon. At least collecting the 50 Golden Skulltulas you need is fun. Past that, I can't really say it's anything more than pointless, especially considering after 50 you don't get any rewards until you hit 100, where the last guy gives you 200 rupees. Yeah, not exactly worth it. But I do appreciate that you can look on the map and figure out which areas you fully cleared out and which you haven't in terms of finding Skulltula. It makes the process of finding 100 much less annoying. Additionally, the horseback riding archery minigame, while laughably easy with the gyroscope, is a fun diversion, and so is hunting for Poes in Hyrule Field, even if their triggers are super sensitive and you have to individually collect all 10 souls in empty bottles when you can only have a max of 3 bottles up to that point. I don't need to explain why that's tedious. Thankfully, the merchant you need to run them to is right at the beginning of Hyrule Castletown, so overall I wouldn't say the quest to get them is super annoying. The magic beans are pretty cool because they make use of the time travel. I haven't touched on this yet, but you can switch between child and adult Link at the Temple of Time if you return or draw the Master Sword from its pedestal. If you planted a magic bean as child Link, you can return to that spot as adult Link to ride the plant to the heart pieces.
I missed my ultimate, bro.
I really like this use of time travel.
Take
You
my
can
auto
do
to
something
800.
similar with the guy playing the Song of Storms. He teaches you the Song of Storms in the future because he hates that some kid played it in the past. That kid is child Link. So you revert to a child, or the same guy, and play the Song of Storms.
If it'll let me anyways. It's a very good climb. We had all girls, I think. As you can see. Yeah, this is my first game on it. Imagine. He tried to carry so hard, poor guy. I know he left, but I wanted to say it. Thai team, love you, baby. The Evelyn and sad. Yeah, that was like weird because we were winning for a really long time, and then they got a few good fights, and then we had to come back. Renekton, I think I just hit him in the last fight and he was gone. I mean, there's only one of them left. Ash may have been trolling, I'm not certain. I kept pretending to be the Nami. I wonder if they're grouped. Alright, let's find out if I was right to vaccine. That's basically what I built, except I got the big boy armor. Oh, they do max Q. Her mobility is pretty strong, I'd say. Yeah, the ult is a bit tricky. I think it would be good with maybe a proto build. I would also add some tank as well. They want me. Alright, thanks for watching. Neeko is cool. She's cooler than Kassadin because she's ranged, so it's easier to farm.
Aware of enemies around you. In order to ensure that combat flows better,
This is the Evelyn from the first game.
if you press and hold the L button, or the Z button in the case of the N64 controller, you recenter the camera on that enemy. Link's controls change when locked on. Instead of turning when moving left, Link will now strafe around the enemy. He can also do a jump attack and backflip when strafing that he can't perform in his normal state. His basic attacks include horizontal and vertical slashes, as well as a stab he can perform when the analog stick is pushed upward. Additionally, you can spin the control stick around to perform a spin attack, or you can hold down the attack button to charge the spin attack for more damage. I'd be lying if I said the swordplay had depth. It really doesn't. The enemy AI is pretty poor. They often just hold their guard up and strafe around Link until they eventually attack you, leaving themselves open. The problem is they sometimes take a very, very long time to attack you. Since there's a lot of waiting involved in combat, I found myself spamming the spin attack more times than I would have liked. It's just too reliable a move for me to not spam it. Whenever there's an opening, a spin attack will always follow up that opening reliably, and occasionally it can cut right through enemies even during their guard. I'm thankful Link's other items can influence the combat. The hookshot can stun an enemy, giving you more time to follow up, and the bow can obviously damage enemies. It isn't a huge amount of variety, but it does serve to spice up the combat even a little bit. And trust me, with the pacing of these battles, you really need that. Unfortunately, the Z targeting isn't perfect. There are numerous times where the game will take priority to recentering the camera over locking onto an enemy. Meaning if you turn around to lock onto an enemy, there are several occasions where the game will just center the camera instead of locking on. This irks me a lot when fighting Peace. The fastest way to take them out is to lock onto them and shoot them with your bow, but more often than not, the camera would center instead of locking on, leaving me open to a hit while I try to lock on proper. The priority should have been placed on the lock on, not the centering of the camera. I'd say Dark Souls is a much better evolution of Zelda combat. It's much harder, the enemy AI is much more intelligent and harder to avoid, and it lends a sense of complexity to fights that simply isn't present in Ocarina of Time. The combat is just boring. It's severely underdeveloped, and I'm glad there aren't a metric fuck ton of enemies, or the game would fall flat on its face. Some of the bosses seem to suffer from some of the same issues, although most of them are pretty fun to fight. Bongo Bongo suffers from the Z targeting issue. Since there are 3 targets, his 2 hands and his head, targeting can prove to be slightly problematic. You can end up locking onto the wrong portion of his body, and for some reason locking onto his head is a bit finicky, which makes the fight a bit of an annoyance when you're first adjusting. Outside of that though, he's the only boss which is defeated with an item from another dungeon. You use the bow in tandem with the Lens of Truth, so you're still using a dungeon item to beat him, a la the Lens of Truth, but the added use of the bow gives the boss a sense of variety that I enjoy. The rest of the boss fights aren't particularly hard, but they are satisfying enough to fight. The first 3 bosses aren't anything to write home about, I'll admit. I mean, throw bomb into mouth, hit head, avoid, repeat isn't exactly compelling. Phantom Ganon though, he's cool. You have to constantly twirl around your bow to find Ganon in the paintings. You also have to make use of audio cues to make sure you're looking at the right one, because in some of the paintings there's a fake Phantom Ganon. His second phase is Energy Tennis, where you hit the energy back at him with the correct timing. You don't have to use your sword though, you can use an empty bottle, which I find very, very amusing. I'd also ask you pay attention to some of the videos I'm going to do later in this series. The Phantom Ganon fights all make use of the empty bottle, and it's fucking hilarious. I don't know why it's so amusing to me. Quinrova is a similarly fun boss, although unfortunately you can't use your empty bottle to reflect their ice and fire beams. Instead, you use the mirror shield to reflect them. A much more boring solution, but one that makes more sense in the context of the dungeon. You have to shoot the fire and ice beams back at them until they fuse together. Then you have to absorb either 3 of their fire or 3 of their ice shots until it overcharges them and you can attack them. Again, none of these bosses are incredibly challenging. Most of them are piss easy, but the majority of them require at least an ounce of thought to beat, and for that I think they're satisfactory. Plus, none of them overstay their welcome. By no means the best in the series, but they are passable. Ganondorf is a little bit lackluster though. His first phase is Energy Tennis with the added bonus of shooting him with light arrows. It's kind of interesting because you can't lock onto him due to his immense power, but all that complexity really adds is that you just have to shoot him with your bow and arrow instead. The atmosphere of his second phase is really deadly, and it's cool that he handicaps you by knocking away the Master Sword. It's just a shame that you hold on to the big Goron sword, so if you've done that side quest, you don't feel nearly as defenseless. In addition, if you pay attention to Ganon's AI, he isn't the brightest boss in town. Avoiding his attacks is as easy as rolling under his legs or dodging to the right or left. Though I have to say, the music is on point. I love it.
Why?
Most of the music is ambient dungeon, cave music that serves to fit the mood of each area.
Why is woods.
The standout pieces, though, are Hyrule Field and the Lost Woods, as well as the various ocarina songs you can learn. They're very memorable and stick with you long after the credits play. Thank you, Koji Kondo. I love that man. Graphically, it improves quite a great deal on its N64 counterpart, and is one of the better looking 3DS games. Everything has been remodeled. The backgrounds actually have models this time around, so Hyrule Castletown looks decent. Aesthetically, it's pretty standard fare, although I think the dungeon designs are part of the reason they're so fun to play around in. What this game lacks in satisfactory puzzles, it makes up for in unique visual design to make each temple distinct. The Forest Temple is easy to distinguish from the Fire Temple, and so on. I will say that they all sort of look like temples. I mean, I guess that's the point. I would have liked a bit more unique visual variety because a lot of them seem like they have the same structure. A lot of them look like ruins. A lot of them have similar looking doors and switches. Really, it's the colors and everything surrounding the dungeon that makes it look different. You know, the Forest Temple is green, the Fire Temple is red, the Water Temple is blue.
Oh
but
my
a lot
gosh,
of them
they
just
really
look
blew you on
too
that.
similar to my tastes. Let's
okay.
talk about the frame rate. You know, even if it's only 30 FPS, it's much better than the laughable 20 FPS of the N64 version. My god, that game runs terribly. I'm obviously disappointed the remake couldn't have targeted 60 FPS, but I mean, fuck it. I guess I've come to expect 30 nowadays. I am one of those PC Master Race snobs that takes nothing below 60 after all. Before we end the video, I suppose I should touch on Master Quest. It only changes
my
how
queue
the
doesn't
dungeons
launch
are
out the
designed.
casters,
It doesn't
'cause
change anything
it's
in
a
the
different game than
overworld
last
or
game.
any of the side quests. In the 3DS version,
My mana's
it mirrors the
grateful, so I
world
can
as well,
still
making it a
buy
bit
it.
more
Plus, I
challenging
think
on a repeat playthrough where you're familiar with a specific layout. For the most part, the challenge of Master Quest is its greatest asset. It makes use of the fact that you probably know the mechanics very well, and it tests your knowledge of them to various extremes. Take the Great Deku Tree. The vanilla version didn't teach you about lighting Deku sticks on fire until after you fell and broke through the webbing. In Master Quest, you're expected to know you can burn webbing with a lit Deku stick. The dungeon uses this to its advantage and makes it the central theme of the entire dungeon, taking it beyond where it ever was in the vanilla version. Take the room with the spinning cylinder of spikes. In the vanilla version, you had to dive underwater to activate a switch that would lower the water level so you could take the movable platform across it and be safe under the spike cylinder. This switch doesn't exist in Master Quest, so the solution is to duck under the spike cylinder instead. But you also have to stand on a switch that activates a torch next to you. As soon as you step off the switch, the torch deactivates. So you need to use your Deku stick and quickly run over to the fire and jump onto the platform before it moves away from you, duck under the spike cylinder, and light the two torches to open the door. This wouldn't work as well if you didn't have the knowledge you acquired by doing a normal playthrough. If Zelda were to adopt a difficulty selection, I'd rather have this than some of the solutions posited by future remakes, which only tweak damage. This isn't to say Master Quest is executed perfectly. It's more to say I would prefer this route for adding difficulty to Zelda games. Master Quest has a couple frustrating aspects that keep it from realizing its full potential. Firstly, many of the dungeons begin to use Song of Time blocks as a means to waste your time. They place them in strange places, and the only option you have to move them is to pull out your ocarina and play the Song of Time. In terms of engagement, it's about as interesting as pushing a block around. Secondly, there are moments present even in the first dungeon that you'll have to backtrack if you want to collect everything. The Great Deku Tree requires both the ocarina and bombs to fully complete it, which you can't obtain until you progress further into the game. I do still think it's worth playing Master Quest in addition to a run-through of the normal game. It's no holds barred in terms of what mechanics they'll splice into each of the dungeons. You actually see a silver rupee puzzle as early as Dodongo's Cavern. I can't stress how vital Master Quest is in strengthening the replayability of Ocarina of Time. The mirrored world helps this too. It sounds like a simple change, but it completely changes how you look at the dungeon, especially if you know the dungeon layout very well. In addition to the puzzles being completely reworked, you'll now have to accept that left means right and right means left. It's enough to keep the extra playthrough fresh, and it's a shame a concept like Master Quest has never been attempted since. It's yet another reason Ocarina of Time has aged marvelously, even when you only
think
factor
that
in
was
the
just-
improvements added in the 3DS remake. Despite that, the core game is still incredibly solid. I have no doubt that if I were to pick up the N64 version, I could get into it. I might not like the aiming or the iron boots, but it
Sid
would still
doesn't
be an
actually do that
accessible
much damage
3D
either.
Zelda
Reason
experience.
to be so
I'm
scared.
shocked at how much I ended up really enjoying this game. I remember all those years ago, I didn't think much of it on my first playthrough, but upon playing it again for review, I have a newfound respect for it. It was the first of its kind in so many ways. It had practically no points of reference. How do we do an action-adventure game in 3D? There are so many variables to consider, so many potential problems that pop up when making the leap. Ocarina of Time managed pretty damn well despite its flaws. I wouldn't say it's among my favorite Zelda games, but I can say it's improved in my mind. I used to think a bit less of it, but I can safely say this is a solid first attempt. It may have been outdone since, but I don't think it takes away from how great Ocarina of Time still is. For that, it earns my respect. Up next, Majora's Mask, the Black Sheep. But I mean, because of its resurgence in popularity as of late, I'm not even sure if I can still call it a black sheep. I'll be covering that game's 3DS remake, with perhaps a bit more emphasis on its original version. Join me then, if you will. In regards to the video at hand, I hope you agree with me, but if you don't, feel free to leave a comment below. I'm always willing to have a discussion about anything. All you have to do is ask. If you liked the video, feel free to give it a thumbs up, and if you didn't like it, feel free to give it a thumbs down. All I ask is that you tell me why you liked or didn't like it so I can take that feedback and improve myself, my content, and my channel. Thank you for watching.
That's why you
My
take
name has been
this.
King K, and I certainly hope you have some well-deserved fun today.
That's so good. I don't get to have minions. Not really. It doesn't live unless the first hit hits.
I suppose it was inevitable that 3D Zelda would eventually attempt to take advantage of the insane popularity of Ocarina of Time. Twilight Princess adopts many ideas and motifs from Ocarina. Start off in a forest village, only to leave on a quest that takes you first through a forest temple and a tree, a fire temple in Death Mountain with Gorons, a water temple in Lake Hylia with Zora. Hyrule Field is somewhat
I could
barren,
ignite it,
but with
maybe.
little holes to dig under and random heart pieces to find. Hyrule Castletown is back with minigames to play. The final dungeon is in Hyrule Castle, which has been taken over once again by Ganondorf. I could go on and on. I don't deny the similarities. I could never deny them with a straight face. What I hope to do with this video is refute the argument that its similarities weaken it. Quite the contrary, as you'll come to find. Before we do that, let's go over the remake changes for the final time. The remake is based on the GameCube version, where Link is left-handed. When you play Hero Mode, returning from the Wind Waker, the game is based on the Wii version, where Link is right-handed and the map is flipped. I grew up with the Wii version, so it was a hell of a time coming to grips with the mirrored map, but I'm glad I at least have the option to play the Wii version. I wish there was an option to play different versions independent of the difficulty, but I get what they were going for here. The mirrored map is integral to the harder nature of Hero Mode. It makes a second playthrough unfamiliar, but for those of us that played the Wii version, it's the other way around. It isn't a perfect solution, but I don't think there exists a perfect solution for this particular dilemma. Gyroscope aiming, improved graphical fidelity and resolution, touchscreen and map control on the gamepad, it's all here and accounted for. Some of the more major changes come with the tweaks to the Tears of Light and Poe Hunt quests. The amount of tears you need to find has been reduced to 12 from 16. I'm not sure how much this really helps, since a lot of the tears that were removed were close together to begin with. I never minded the Tears of Light anyway, so I don't even think the change was warranted, but I'll get into that when I discuss the actual game. They've also added a Poe lantern that helps you find Poes. It'll light up whenever you're near a Poe, even during the day when they aren't around. This makes the Poe hunt a lot easier, and it's the reason I enjoy it much more than the Golden Skulltula hunt in Ocarina. Always nice to see quests like these streamlined, though it would have been much better if it didn't take up a slot on the face button. It's better than nothing, though. There are other small changes like rupees no longer going back in the chest if they don't fit your wallet, and your sword no longer hitting walls, both of which I'm very thankful for. The rupee thing seems convenient on paper, but it hurts my soul to see chests on my map that I
If
missed,
I build
and
armor, she's still
I never
gonna
went
wreck
back
me.
just to get the rupees because they're so abundant anyway. The sword not hitting the wall is a break in realism I'm totally okay with. I didn't even like it in Dark Souls, so you can imagine I didn't like it in the original version of Twilight Princess. This is the first Zelda game to come with amiibo support. You can increase the difficulty by tapping the Ganondorf amiibo on the gamepad, and you take 2 times more damage. This stacks on top of hero mode, so if you really want to, you can pair the two together for the ultimate Zelda challenge. The other amiibo that changes the game in a major way is Wolf Link, which you can only get by buying the physical version. It unlocks the Cave of Shadows, a 50-floor combat dungeon you can only complete using Wolf Link. The dungeon itself is somewhat fun and makes better use of Wolf Link than in the actual game. The reward is why this is worth completing. You get the Giant's Wallet, which can store 9,999 rupees. Holy shit. You'll never have a problem then. I have to admit, it's a bit overkill. I think the 5,000 in the Wind Waker was fine enough, but it's a fantastic reward, and it's a better cap than the 2,000 you get normally from doing the bug hunt for Agatha. Unfortunately, this has a negative effect on that bug hunt. The reward for collecting all of the bugs is the biggest wallet at 2,000 rupees. When I say biggest, I mean the biggest you can obtain without amiibo. I already had a pretty major problem with this side quest because Agatha feeds you rupees every time you give her bugs, even more rupees if you give her a pair. You get an insane amount of rupees from this, but you can only have a max of 1,000 rupees up to that point. Eventually, you'll run out of room, but the most insulting part of it is that once you've finished giving her all the bugs, that's when she upgrades your wallet by another 1,000. Gee, thanks for all the rupees that are now in the void. The introduction of the Giant's Wallet fixes the quest, but it also means that all you get out of bug collecting are rupees. Not too compelling a reward considering they don't have much use outside of the magic armor. And I feel the same way about the magic armor as I did in the Wind Waker. I have an additional problem with the Giant's Wallet, which is a problem I have with amiibo support in general. See, the Ganondorf amiibo adds a layer of difficulty on top of what's already in the
Nice,
game.
yeah,
He isn't
yes.
necessary for a harder playthrough, but he can add
That
difficulty
Neeko bomb
if you have it.
mechanics.
This is the perfect way to use amiibo. You probably won't feel like you're missing out if you don't have the amiibo, but if you do, you get a little something extra for your playthrough. Wolf Link is the wrong way to use amiibo, with good intentions. It adds a very substantial reward, yet introduces the possibility that the Giant's Wallet may never be obtainable in the future if the Wolf Link amiibo ever becomes rare or unobtainable. Even more severe, the Cave of Shadows is an entire labyrinth of rooms that may not be accessible in the far future. This locking of substantial content under something not readily accessible is unforgivable. They stepped way too far in making amiibo support more helpful. Keep it simple, nothing too substantial, or players are going to feel left out, especially if they bought the
Which
digital
one's the
version.
real one?
Graphically, the remake is a nice upres, but it's the least improved game out of all the remakes. This is partly because the game is the newest out of all the remakes, but it's also because Twilight Princess's art style isn't as timeless. Neither were the art styles of Ocarina or Majora, but that's why they were remade. Twilight Princess went for a somewhat more realistic art style, and we're already seeing the toll it took on the game years later. Some textures, even after an upres, still look outdated by modern standards, and character models are, well, just look at the faces.
Technically.
Not all models look bad. I like Link and Zelda, but every other human looks way too strange. The strength of the visuals are in the Goron, Zora, and Twilight. The more cartoonish realist hybrid works better for these more outlandish creatures. Maybe they were trying to make the humans look more goofy to fit in better with the more goofy creatures. But why then do Link, Zelda, even Ronaldo have more realistic facial structures than anyone else in the entire game? It just strikes me out. I will commend the remake for taking a more hands-off approach. They overdid it with the Wind Waker, so I'm glad to see there's not excessive bloom or anything here. The colors pop, and you can see everything clearly. The higher resolution is a nice touch-up and all the game really needed. This is one of the best remakes you could ask for. It's not very obtrusive, and it fixes a few of the minor issues with the original. They didn't go too far like with Zora Link or the overdone visuals of the Wind Waker. It's more in line with Ocarina of Time 3D. Alright, let's get serious. The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess is currently my favorite 3D Zelda game, perhaps my favorite Zelda ever made. I wonder how unpopular that opinion is. Be sure to let me know. But wait, let me explain as always. Twilight Princess has but one strength, one concise message that threads almost every aspect of the game into a satisfying whole. Twilight Princess is epic, and I mean epic. You know, before people ran that word into the ground and it lost all of its meaning. When someone describes to you an epic adventure, how do you respond? Your mind might wander to the original Zelda, a game that's free, open, leaves everything in your hands. Or you might think of the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. You're the chosen dragonborn, the world is yours for the taking. I mean, personally, I prefer Oblivion, but that's just me. Or you might think more linear. Uncharted does a fantastic job letting you play through the events of a bombastic action-adventure movie. I can agree with all of these, but the single game that comes to mind when I think of the word adventure would be Twilight Princess. Perhaps that might change with Breath of the Wild, but I won't know until I play. I've stated many times how much I enjoy non-linear Zelda. I think it's the right step for the series to take in the future. Yet, I've also made sure to state how a more linear progression is in no way a bad approach, and Twilight Princess is probably the reason I feel that way. Twilight Princess is significantly more linear than the previous two 3D Zelda games. Again, think more along the lines of Ocarina of Time 2.0. You have a ton of dungeons to explore and an epic main quest to follow. The non-linearity comes in the optional extras you can do around Hyrule. I'd like to tackle one of the biggest complaints levied toward this game, Hyrule Field. I've seen countless arguments depicting Hyrule Field as barren and lifeless. Apparently, there's not a lot to do here. I, of course, argue there's much more to Hyrule Field than most would let on. There's certainly more to explore here than in Ocarina. You can dig under holes to find secret caves, that's the same as ever. But Hyrule Field is much bigger this time around. It had to be split into several pieces because it was so big. However, it's not Wind Waker levels of big. Each part of the overworld is small enough that it isn't overwhelming, and it allows for each segment to pack meaningful content into that smaller space. For instance, there are several areas where you can use the double claw shot, or the spinner, or the Gale Boomerang to find heart pieces. In addition, Lake Hylia and Gerudo Desert offer substantial chunks of land to explore for even more goodies and minigames. Gerudo Desert more so, which is a sprawling desert holding some heart pieces and the Cave of Ordeals, a 50-floor combat dungeon similar to the Cave of Shadows and the Savage Labyrinth from the Wind Waker. It's the most difficult thing I've ever had to complete in a Zelda game, I'll tell you that much. It makes use of every single enemy type and obstacle in the game, which requires the use of your entire arsenal of weapons and items. Pair that with the extensive list of hidden abilities you can learn for combat, and the Cave of Ordeals is a very fun challenge. And that's all packed into just the Gerudo Desert. Lake Hylia isn't as big, but you can fish, my life, and do both the upward and downward portions of the river rapids. If travel time is your issue, you get the ability to fast travel around the same time you do in Ocarina. The fast travel points are pretty liberal, but there always seems to be a fast travel point wherever you need it. If not, you have a Pony, and in this game you'll have her right around the second dungeon to roam around Hyrule Field with. She's also mandatory, so there's no chance you'll miss out on her. Add that to the small map size I mentioned earlier, and a beautiful compromise is struck between the amount of content available and the amount of time you spend traveling. Add that to the small map size I mentioned earlier, and a beautiful compromise is struck between the amount of content and the amount of time you spend traveling. The scale of Hyrule is kept without sacrificing the enjoyment of that world. See, what people are complaining about with Hyrule Field is that it isn't as sprawling as the maps of the original Zelda and A Link to the Past, or at least that the scale of the world doesn't translate to a realistic depiction of what Hyrule Field from Zelda 1 would look like in a 3D space. At least, that's what I assume people are complaining about. That's why everyone's so excited for Breath of the Wild's huge map. I can't blame them for that. It's part of the reason I'm excited for Breath of the Wild as well. However, thus far in the retrospective, this is the best overworld of 3D Zelda. It's larger and packs more of a punch than Ocarina of Time, is effortless to travel through because of the warp points in Epona, and exploring it is much more interesting and takes up less time than it ever did in The Wind Waker. In that one fell swoop, it improves on Ocarina of Time and The Wind Waker while also inheriting Termina Field's ease of access. I didn't mention this in the Majora's Mask video, but I do like Termina Field. See, since Clocktown is in the center, it makes traveling to each quadrant of the map much easier. I already mentioned how Goron Link makes travel very effortless, and paired with Epona, I really didn't have to worry about long stretches of land that I had to conquer. Twilight Princess takes that ease of travel and pairs it with a larger scale and even more content. This is also the best rendition of any overworld theme. Yeah, I like it a little better than the Great Sea and Sue.
Killed that camp so fast. That's some pirate teamwork.
An overworld doesn't need to be large to feel meaningful to explore. It just needs to pack meaningful content to
They wanna push me.
In this regard, The Wind Waker failed to deliver, where Twilight Princess strikes a very good balance. I'm not gonna suck the game's dick though. While I do think it's the best overworld, I won't argue that it could have packed in even more content for Hyrule to feel truly rich. They could have made even more use of your dungeon items to unlock secret passageways, for instance. As it stands, there's a passable amount of content in Hyrule.
Yeah, I guess tier 2
The
turrets
side
doesn't matter
objectives
too
are set
much.
up
It's
in
okay,
much the same
they should
way.
have this.
You have the heart pieces to collect, rupees to find, pose to hunt, mini games to play, even trading sequences that are thankfully much better than anything in Ocarina. Heart containers are now obtained when you collect 5 heart pieces instead of 4. This is because Twilight Princess has the
missed the
highest
cue on a
dungeon
rooted
count in
target.
3D
It's
games,
pretty
and it
dumb.
also adds a few heart pieces to each of those dungeons. I'm a fan of this change because it fills each dungeon with more to explore, just like the Stray Fairies did in Majora's Mask. Though it shares a problem with The Wind Waker in a change that comes with the HD version I've decided to save until now. In the original version, some chests had rupees, which aren't an insanely satisfying reward, but were a tangible reward that helped you in some fashion.
I kinda
Many
wish
of
the
them
ult
have
was
been
something more
replaced
immediate, but
for
I'd say she's pretty decent champion.
stamps.
I could just
They
hit the
function to give
Nexus.
you more to put in your picture messages on Miiverse, Nintendo's social media platform for the Wii U. Suffice to say, this reward sucks. It's even worse than Joy Pendants, which had in-game applications if even for only a short period. Stamps don't serve a single function in-game, so it makes the
We had a
process
lot
of
of
collecting them very frustrating. It's not as severe when the chest you stumbled across isn't hard to find. There's a chest in the Forest Temple that requires you to swim under some low-hanging hole in the wall, and that
Yeah,
chest
so
has a stamp. It's
I
a
didn't
much
really
less
go to
severe
fights, though,
slap
I
in the
kinda just
face
split.
because you really didn't have to work all that hard to get it. Let's compare that to a chest in the City in the Sky. There's an offshoot area midway through the dungeon with some key hats leading to a floating island with a tree and a Poe. You see the island earlier on, but you can't get to it yet. Once you do, you wait in anticipation for what you'll find there, and it's a stamp. Great. Many of the chests that do contain heart pieces are easy to